welcome to Working with the Tax Law. So there are a few sources prioritized from low to high in terms of tax law. So on the bottom, we have administrative actions, then we have judicial decisions, and then at the highest priority, we have our statutory law. Then we have here the Constitution overall, and then we have the three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial branch. So the executive enacts laws, legislative enacts laws, executive enforces those laws, and judicial is the court system that interpret the law. So in the legislative branch, we have the 16th Amendment, and that is enforced by the Department of Treasury through Article 3 of the court systems. Then in the legislative branch, we have the IRS, the Internal Revenue Code, and that's enforced by the IRS. And then we have Treasury regulations that can ultimately be seen in the Supreme Court. And the IRS gives us revenue rulings. And then below the Supreme Court, we have the U.S. Court of Appeals and the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And the U.S. Court of Appeals gives us our district court and our tax court. So this is a nice table that summarizes the source of the law, the authority for which they have, and the laws that they've enacted. So this is a great little summary table that I highly recommend you look into. So the 16th Amendment was adopted in February 25th of 1913, and it states that Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on income from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. That means that this 16th Amendment has been enacted over 100 years. So now let's talk about our tax authority. This initially was created by the Revenue Act of 1913, and in 1939, the entire federal tax law was codified and entitled the Internal Revenue Code of 1939. Then in 1951, we have a new codification of the code that was issued, and the present code is the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, but it has been subsequently amended. So here, let's talk about the Internal Revenue Code and its organization. So we start with a subtitle, which leads us then into chapters and subchapters. Then we move into parts and subparts, sections and subsections, to finally get to the paragraphs and the subparagraphs. So the subtitles of the Internal Revenue Code have sections, right? So subtitle A is about income taxes, B is estate and gift taxes, C is employment taxes, and D is miscellaneous taxes. And then you see the subtitle and the sections that relate to each one of those subtitles. So the legal impact of the Internal Revenue Code. There are sources of statutory law on taxation, and they must be adhered to unless a provision is declared unconstitutional. Only Congress can amend the code. And then ambiguous provisions of the code, those are interpreted by the courts. So how a bill becomes tax law, the entire legislative process. We start with the House Ways and Means Committee, then the bill is considered by the House, it moves to the Senate Finance Committee, then it's considered by the Senate, and in the consideration of the Senate, it might go to the Joint Conference Committee if there is a difference. Right? So if the House and Senate did not agree, it would move towards that Joint Conference Committee, then it's considered again by both the House and the Senate for final approval or veto by the president. And so if the president approves it, it's incorporated into the code. But if the president vetoes it, then it's overridden. Administrative sources of law. As the chief executive, the president must enforce the collection of taxes. So authority for this function has then been delegated to the Treasury Department. And then administration of the tax system, that's been delegated by the Treasury ultimately to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. So the Treasury's functions, they enact regulations. So there's official Treasury interpretation of the code, and to the extent the regulations are consistent with the code, then the Treasury has the force and the effect of the law. So the Treasury would issue revenue rulings or private rulings. They could issue revenue procedures, determination letters, and they manage conflicts with taxpayers. Regulations and all of the stages of adoption. We have either proposed, temporary, or final. So proposed regulations are a preview of the final regulations, but they have no legal precedence. Then temporary regulations, they are issued with guidance that is needed quite quickly, and they have the same authoritative value as the final regulations. And final regulations have force and effect of the law, and they're binding on both the taxpayers and the Treasury. So final regulations could be procedural, interpretive, or legislative. So procedural are usually just housekeeping instructions. Interpretive might implement the intent of committee reports or the intent of the code. Legislative allows the Treasury to determine those details of the law, but Congress must specifically delegate this authority at that point. Then we have revenue rulings. So these are based on facts common to many taxpayers. It is binding on the IRS, and taxpayers can rely upon these revenue rulings or challenge them in court. But the courts are not bound by the revenue rulings. And these are usually published weekly in what's known as the Internal Revenue Bulletin. So you might just want to Google Internal Revenue Bulletin and see what's out there. Then we have private rulings. So this is at the request of a particular taxpayer. The IRS is bound by its determination in the ruling, and then this is made available to the public after deletion of any materials that need to be deleted before it can be made public. But this private ruling cannot be relied on by other taxpayers as precedent, but it can provide insight into the positions that the IRS takes. So that's why we want to read them. Then we have determination letters. So these are issued by district directors for returns filed within their districts. It must be a completed transaction, and it's issued only if the answer is covered by a particular statute or a Treasury decision or regulation or a ruling opinion on court decisions that was published in the Internal Revenue Bulletin. Then we have revenue procedures. So these describe the internal practices and procedures within the IRS, and they're published also in the Internal Revenue Bulletin. And they generally state changes that is either in techniques or in administrative procedures that are used by the IRS. Then we have judicial sources of law. So this is the courts, right, where they interpret any ambiguity in the statute, but they cannot issue advisory opinions, and there needs to be a case or a controversy for the courts. And court opinions are binding on lower courts, the IRS, and taxpayers. Administrative sources of the tax system, right? These are all managed by the IRS, and they have several important issues. You could have statute of limitations, interest and penalties, audits, and dispute resolutions. So the statute of limitations, here you see the general statute of limitations under section 6501 is 3 years, but then you see that you could have 2 to 10 years varying depending on what the situation is. But notice there is no statute of limitation if you fraud the IRS. So interest and penalties. So your interest accrues from the due date of the return, and it's paid on refunds if not received within 45 days of filing. And you might incur penalties if you fail to file your return or if you fail to pay your taxes. And there is also accuracy-related penalties, fraud penalties, underpayment of estimated tax penalties, and you can be incurred penalties for negligence in filing your returns. So failure to pay and failure to file penalties. So if you fail to file your tax return, it is 5% per month or part thereof. If there was fraud in that, then that increases to 15%. To a maximum of 25% or 5 months, and if there's fraud, that would be 75%. If your tax return is 60 days late, then there is a minimum of $435 penalty or 100% of the tax due, and this could also be reduced by failure to pay your penalty. So now if you don't pay, failure to pay your taxes, then you have a 0.5% per month or part thereof, and that could be a maximum of 50 months here for 25%. So here you have some situations about taxpayer non-compliance penalties. So several years ago, Clark failed to file a tax return or pay his taxes. He owed $5,000 in taxes. Clark's tax return and his tax payment are both now 22 months overdue. Clark is subject to a failure to pay penalty of $1,250. The maximum is 25% times the $5,000 that he owes. He is also subject to a failure to pay penalty of $550 based on the 22 months that he owes the $5,000 at 0.5%. So fortunately for Clark, because he is subject to both the failure to file and failure to pay penalty, the first 5 months of delinquencies is subject to the maximum 25% penalty. Thereafter, the $5,000 that's the unpaid balance is still subject to your 0.5% failure to pay of $425. So he now owes $1,675, right? So you have the $1,250 that we determined plus an additional $425. So we have the $1,650. Lovely. So, and here you see all of the different calculations, the failure to pay for the first 5 months, and then the failure to pay for the first 5 months penalties, then the total initial, less the failure to pay for the first 5 months, plus your total of failure to pay for the next 17 months. And that's how we come up with the $1,675. Moral of the story, file your taxes and pay your taxes timely, because it can get expensive otherwise. So accuracy related penalties, there is 20% penalty for your underpayment and 30% if it is due to undisclosed listed transactions. Some of the causes for this accuracy related penalty is you fail to make a good faith effort to comply with the tax law. There could also be a substantial understatement of your tax liability, and that is defined as more than 10% of the correct tax liability. You can have a substantial understatement in your valuation or in your estate or gift tax. Fraud penalties, 75% of underpayment of penalty and $5,000 for a frivolous or incomplete tax return. This could also lead to criminal prosecution. And depending on how this was about is whether you're charged with a felony or a misdemeanor. So when you fail, if it's a willful failure to file or pay your taxes, then it's a misdemeanor, but you can have a penalty of up to $25,000 and 1 year in prison. If it's a willful attempt to evade or a willful false return, then those are penalties. And if it's an attempt to evade, your penalty could be up to $100,000 and 5 years. But if it's a false return, then it would be $100,000 and 3 years. Now, there are also penalties for those that prepare taxes, and they can be either a procedural penalty or a statutory penalty. So as a preparer, if you fail to provide the copy of the return, if you fail to sign as a preparer, or if you fail to keep a copy or maintain a client list, those are all examples of procedural penalties. Statutory penalties are sometimes understatements due to an unrealistic position or a willful attempt to understate your tax or a failure to exercise due diligence. So for example, if you didn't check for the earned income credit or the child tax credit or the American Opportunity Tax credit, then you're failing to exercise your due diligence as a tax preparer. So the mission of the IRS is to provide American taxpayers top quality service by helping them understand and meet their tax responsibilities and enforce the law with integrity and fairness to all. You be the judge if they are meeting their mission. Then we have the IRS can do audits, right? So they can look and see if there is a mix match of your returns to supporting documentation, if there is a discriminant inventory function where the computer matches and scores your return based on how likely it is to get audited. There are typically several types of audits, such as related party or target compliance audits or financial status audits. And there's also subsequent claims for refunds. So here are the audits that were completed in 2018, and you see that there were a total of 892,187 audits on individual income tax returns. And you see the breakdown between field and correspondence audits. And then we have corporate income tax return audits, estate and trust income tax returns, just estate returns, and employment tax returns as well. And then math errors on tax returns as of 2017 year was, so you had a lot of tax calculations and other taxes, like almost 39% of that. And then the next biggest error was your exemption amount or the exemption number. So there are dispute resolution processes. So if you get an examination letter, you have a 30-day letter, right? So the taxpayer can appeal to the IRS office within 30 days. And the IRS office is separate from the examination division. So if there's no internal appeal, then there is a 90-day letter that is issued. And that's your notice of delinquency. And that says that the taxpayer has 90 days to pay or file a petition in tax court or pay the tax and file suit in your district court or your U.S. Court of Federal Claims. So the federal judiciary system, we took a look at this at the beginning of this PowerPoint, but we start with the U.S. Supreme Court. And then we have the U.S. Court of Appeals, which is regional. And then we have the Federal Circuit and the Appellate Court. And then you see the U.S. Court of Appeals, the regional circuit. That's where our tax court is, and that's where our district court is. So the U.S. Tax Court, if you file suit here, no payment of taxes necessary. The trial by jury is not available. And the small tax case division, they handle deficiencies up to $50,000, but it has to be at the taxpayer's request. And then their informal procedures, no appeal rights. So the tax court decision does not bind the IRS with respect to other taxpayers. And the appeals are to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Then you have the U.S. District Court. Here, the tax deficiency has to be paid in advance, and the only forum is the jury trial, and bound by the decisions of the Appeals Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. And then the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, this is only in Washington, D.C., and the tax deficiencies must be paid to proceed, and the appeal is to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And then the U.S. Court of Appeals, we have 12 circuit courts, and they handle the appeals from both the tax court and the district court. And the Court of Appeals in one circuit is not bound to follow those decisions of the Court of Appeals in another circuit. The U.S. Supreme Court, right? These decisions are binding for both the taxpayers and the IRS. And the U.S. Supreme Court reviews tax cases if there's a conflict between the circuit courts, or it's really an important and a reoccurring problem in the tax law administration, or there's several taxpayers involved, or the decisions of a lower court conflicts with like long-standing practices of regulations, then these cases might go to the Supreme Court. So here, if you pay your taxes, then you would have a jury trial in a district court, but not in the Court of Federal Appeals. And if you don't want to pay the tax, then your venue would be your tax court. And this is a lovely court comparison. And you see here the types of cases that are heard and whether or not you are required to pay the taxes and the maximum. The only one that has a maximum is the tax court of small claims, and that's the $50,000. And you see the court location and where the appeals of these decisions in these courts would go to. So there is a lot of information available in basic tax research services. So the Internal Revenue Code is the first place when you're conducting tax research. Then you would do the Treasury regulations, you might look at the practice aids or the IRS manual, and you might look at other court citations as well. So there are several periodicals that are a source of tax information. So CCH offers federal tax articles. One of my favorites is the Journal of Taxation if you're doing scholarly work. You have the Tax Magazine, Tax Notes, you have tax articles, you also have the Journal of the Society for Finance Service Professionals. You have estate planning, trust and estates, and the Journal of Financial Planning as well. So the easiest way to keep up with all the new tax developments that happen every year, I would say, is irs.gov. You can also look at CCH and RIA. Those are common sites or accounting firms. Taxprotalk.com is also a nice publication. And then you have the daily tax report. And Lexis and Westlaw usually require library subscriptions, but you can look at all of the tax cases that have been rendered. And you have reached the end of our video lecture. Thanks for watching.